everyone, Alexa Dunn here, and today I am talking about how to nail conflict and stakes in your novel. Now, no book, story, anything works without conflict and stakes. Conflict and stakes are the things that make stuff happen, and not just make stuff happen, but make stuff matter. The conflict and the stakes are the things that make you care about what is happening to your main character or characters and in the plot of your novel. So imagine The Hunger Games without The Hunger Games. If it was just a book about a girl who lived in a coal mining town, and the whole book, I'm trying to think of a book without conflict or stakes, and the whole book was just a girl going to school every day, learning stuff, talking to people. The thing is, all of these things can happen in a book, and you can create conflict and stakes for those things. You could write a book about a girl who lives in a coal mining town, in a terrible place to live, in a dystopic place, and she doesn't necessarily have to enter the Hunger Games and fight for her life for there to be good conflict and stakes. You could theoretically write that quiet, character-driven novel about Katniss living in District 12 and starvation and all that jazz. It would just be a very different book. Whereas The Hunger Games is what we would call very commercial, big conflict, big stakes. And I do have to laugh that, I think my example is literally always The Hunger Games. And I apologize to those of you who are like, oh God, I wish you talked about something other than The Hunger Games. I just really love The Hunger Games. The Hunger Game nails so many things that you should pay attention to when you are writing your novel. It's high concept, it's got great pacing, the inciting incident isn't buried, you care about the characters who are well drawn, the world building is good. Oh, and God, there's a lot of conflict and stakes. And most importantly, there's all the good kinds of conflict and stakes. Really, kinds of conflict. Because there's more than one. So you have your overarching plot conflict, which in The Hunger Games is both they live in a dystopian future where everything is terrible, and she has to fight in the Hunger Games and fight for her life, / she did it to save her sister. All of that is overarching plot conflict. The stakes being she could die. And then later the stakes are her success could start a revolution and, save everyone. So those are conflict and overarching conflict and stakes. There's also character conflict. Characters are always going to have conflicts with each other the same way that people have conflicts with each other. You're in a conversation and someone says something kind of dickish. That's conflict. You're in an interaction with a person and it's just kind of awkward. That's conflict. You are, interacting with characters, and you like them, or they like you, or you like them and they don't like you. That's conflict. There is also internal conflict. Guilt is a fantastic bit of internal conflict, and Katniss also has lots of internal conflict. I shouldn't blow all of my Hunger Games examples because I am going to give you some concrete examples, including from The Hunger Games, of all of these different kinds of conflicts and scene-specific conflict examples to give you ideas of how to weave conflict and stakes into your novel. So internal conflict, guilt, any feelings that a character wrestles with and struggles with, internal conflict. And then there's micro conflict, which is scene level conflict. And it can be tied to the other types of conflict, like that character conflict I mentioned. If you're in a conversation with someone and they say something that's really dickish, that is not only character conflict, that is scene level micro conflict. It is something that kind of buoys a scene and gets it along, oh, how's she gonna react to that? Micro conflict. Cat conflict. Yes. Ginger cat conflict. So showing up while I'm talking about conflict. Well, I guess Teddy really likes conflict. Cat. Okay. And of course, conflict is meaningless without stakes. Your stakes are what your character has to lose, or characters or world have to lose if the conflict doesn't work out. Of course, in many cases, the big stake would be losing your life. There's also stakes like losing, I hesitate to say your soul, but losing a piece of yourself, losing your integrity. It could be losing someone that you love. It could be losing a war, a fight, like, especially you see this in dystopian a lot, like, there's revolution. The stakes are, well, if you lose the war, if you lose the fight, a lot of people die. Death really is a pretty common stake, but it doesn't always have to be stakes. Dissatisfaction, just like being unhappiness. Unhappiness is a great stake. So often we see this in romance, that if you can't be with the person that you love, that you're just going to be miserable. That's a stake. Bigger stakes tend to have bigger emotional payoff. Or I should say, personal stakes tend to have bigger payoff and emotional investment. And you always want to get your readers to emotionally invest in your characters and your story. And you do this through the stakes and how they bounce off of the conflict. So you always want to make them personal / big. It's like a combination of both. And this doesn't mean that death is always the answer, that it's always, oh, you're gonna die, or someone you love is going to die. As I mentioned, it could be losing a piece of yourself or being unhappy. And if you draw your characters and your world and your conflicts well enough, those will be deeply personal stakes to the readers. You have to make the readers care about the stakes so that the conflict is driving them to read and find out what happens. And I'll say that, like, the world is gonna end or people will die are really overdone. Whenever possible, I do encourage writers to delve deeper to find better or different stakes. Or, those stakes can be in your novel, but I encourage writers not to always default to those stakes as the stakes in your query if we're talking about pitching. Because in terms of getting an agent to care about reading, well, of course it's like, well, the world may end. It's just a bit cliche. So always think about how you can make the stakes personal and character specific. That's for pitches, but of course also for the actual writing of the novel. Novels should almost always be character driven. We care about people. Occasionally we do care about worlds or things, but typically we care about worlds and or things because of the people that connect to them. So like Hunger Games, Panem. We care about ending this awful regime because we care about people in the world. We don't want tons of people to die, especially children. So you can kind of tie into like the core things that people tend to care about. Generally, people don't want people to die. That's true. But also we can all connect to the idea that no one wants to be miserable, that not getting, the thing that your heart desires or the thing that would bring you happiness or even just contentedness. I think we can all relate to that drive not to be miserable. So just think about those things. And as kind of a footnote to the characters are important, we need to care, and the best stakes are emotional and personal stakes, the things that your character does should have consequences. It's hard to care or be invested if only good things happen to your character, or if everything your character does results in a success. You have to have setbacks and failures in order to drive conflict and develop character and push the plot forward. So don't be afraid to do bad things to your character or have bad things happen. First of all, it gives you more for your characters to relate to react to, which gives you more to write. Conflict is good, but also having setbacks and failures and good conflict does make you care more. It's this delicate balance. I mean, you don't obviously want to just have it be like, what are all the most horrific things that can possibly have happened in this book? If you make it kitchen sinky conflict, people are gonna nope out. But just don't go the other way and have nothing of consequence happen. When things happen to your character or your character does things, it's always good to give them agency, have them making decisions and trying things and occasionally failing and having setbacks. You're going to create more character engagement in both the conflict, the character, and the stakes. Now, I mentioned this in my pacing video, but I think it's worth bringing it up again. Some what I call structural conflicts. So these are kind of like plot devices for conflict that you can use to introduce conflict structure to your novel. These are just some of my favorite shortcuts that I thought would be worth mentioning again. Big one is the ticking clock, like the countdown. This works really, really well in like thriller novels or adventure novels, action novels, sci-fi. One of my favorite, more recent examples is Illuminae. That book has a big ticking clock. At a certain point, basically everyone's gonna die, big stakes again. But it gives a tenseness to the narrative, or anything where it's a thriller where someone has died, or someone's been kidnapped, or someone's going to die. Like, think of something like And Then There Were None by Agatha Christie. There's a ticking clock there. Every day someone will die. So it gives you, as a writer, something to write towards. Like, okay, my characters only have so much time in which to do things and react to things and to have things happen. It keeps the reader turning pages. Another really good structural conflict device is what I call like the tournament. Think about Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, one of my favorite examples. You have the Triwizard Tournament. So you know that there are 3 tasks. You know approximately when they happen. If I'm remembering correctly, I think there's one every week or so. But J.K. Rowling used this to basically break up her act structure, kind of. Act 1 is obviously everything leading up to it, but then Act 2 was basically like the first task, stuff in between, the second task, and then the third task kicked off the third act of Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. That structure of bam, 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 3 tasks, 3 is a magical number if you're doing a tournament. You can do more, but I don't recommend more than 3, to be honest. It gives you as the writer, again, something that you're writing toward, but also tournaments or anything that's like a competition. Throne of Glass had something like that too. Red Queen has something similar to that, because there's like and think about, like, it doesn't have to be like 3 events in a tournament. Trials or tests, essentially, create a conflict and pacing structure where the reader is reading towards something that is going to happen. And you should always, of course, make sure that your tournament or your trial or your test is high conflict, high stakes. It should be, stuff should happen that is challenging to your character, and the stakes for failure should be high. Now, as promised, I'm going to break down some YA books, some specific examples for each type of conflict. And yes, I am going to start with my perennial favorite, The Hunger Games, even though I've already kind of done some of that. I literally can't help it, guys. Like, I start talking to you about craft and just Hunger Games examples like tumble out of my mouth without even thinking about it. I even knew I was going to be breaking down examples for you, but it's like a disease. It's a Hunger Game example disease. But I'm going to break down those core types of conflict that I mentioned using the Hunger Games. And again, those types are the overarching plot conflict, character conflict, internal conflict, and micro scene level conflict. So let's start with the overarching big conflict of the Hunger Games. Katniss has to fight in the Hunger Games to save her life, and she entered it to save her sister. That's like the main conflict and stakes. She might die. And as I mentioned, eventually there's the revolutionary thing where winning has broader stakes for the world, but also remember, if Katniss wins, she'll save her family from poverty. So there are layers of major plot conflict and stakes in the Hunger Games. Next is the character conflict. Katniss has character conflict with basically everyone. Every character in the Hunger Games is using Katniss, trying to kill her, or want something from her, and all of these dynamics create conflict. Of course, we have Peeta. He just wants her to love him, but that creates a lot of conflict in Katniss, especially internal conflict, which I'm going to talk about next. You have the other tributes want to kill Katniss, and that's big character conflict. Or you have someone like President Snow, who of course wants to kill Katniss as well. But there's a much broader, deeper, manipulative kind of, pairing that happens between those two characters, especially in the subsequent Hunger Games books, but even in the first one. There's a lot of just interesting character conflict in the Hunger Games. There's also, not just even with Katniss, think about other characters who have conflicts with each other. And of course, then there's internal conflict. There's a lot of it in the Hunger Games. My favorite is that Peeta conflict for Katniss. Katniss knows that she has to pretend to have feelings for Peeta at a certain point because it is her best way to win favor and sympathy and possibly win the Hunger Games, thus saving her life. But she feels bad about it. And that leads to lots of delicious internal conflict. And this is actually one of my biggest notes on the movie, where the movie just wasn't quite as satisfying for me, because the beauty of a book is that you can get lots of internal conflict from a book. You're reading it on the page from that person's perspective. And the internal conflict that Katniss has about everything with Peeta and all the strategy she has to employ to win the Hunger Games is fantastic. And then micro and scene level conflict. I mean, there's tons of this in the Hunger Games, but the one that I want to mention is in the beginning, just in the very beginning of the book. It's a great example of starting your novel and having micro conflict in the beginning to also set up character and world building. That's when Katniss is hunting, and Gale distracts her and stops her from killing an animal. The micro conflict there is that she's annoyed with him because he distracted her and she didn't get the kill, and the kill is important because she needs to feed her family. It's minor conflict in the sense that, of course, she's best friends with Gale and she forgives him quickly, but just that kind of little frisson of tension tells you a lot about Katniss as a person, what she's doing, why it's important, who Gale is, and what their relationship is. So just really good example of micro conflict on a scene level. I also want to talk about Frostblood. Disclaimer, if I haven't said it before, Ellie Blake is my critique partner, so I love her book, and I've just read it a lot, so it came right to my mind when I was thinking about conflict. So the overarching plot conflict of Frostblood is that Ruby lives in a world where Firebloods are hunted by the Frostblood. She lives in the Frostblood Kingdom, and Firebloods have been hunted almost to extinction, and she's one of the last remaining Firebloods. So the big overarching plot conflict is Ruby, of course, wants to stay alive, not be captured and found out and killed. But also, after the Frostblood King, his guard, the captain of the guard, kills her mother. And so she has a drive for revenge. So the overarching plot conflict is Ruby wants to kill the king because the king is responsible for hunting down and killing all the Firebloods. But it's also personal because he's essentially responsible for killing her mother. So that's that overarching plot conflict. Then there's a lot of character conflict in Frostblood, but especially romantic character conflict, which I love. Are you seeing a pattern here for me? Ruby and Arcas have a lot of character conflict because at first they don't really like each other. Ruby, as a Fireblood, is kind of impulsive and says what she's thinking and loses her temper a lot, whereas Arcas is a Frostblood and just as a person, he's a lot more serious, he's a lot more reserved, but he's responsible for teaching her how to control her powers. He kind of hates her instinctively for his own reasons because of conflicts between Frostbloods and Firebloods. But also she's really resistant to his training. They butt heads a lot. Just really good, strong character conflict there. And of course, eventually there's romantic character conflict. So that would be a great example of character conflict in Frostblood. Internal conflict, again, perennial favorite, is guilt. Ruby feels very guilty for the fact that her mother died. She feels that she's responsible because the king's soldiers came to her village because of her. Someone found her out, ratted her out, and the soldiers came to the village. They not only murdered her mother, but they burned the village to the ground and killed almost everyone. So she just feels immensely guilty, and this leads to a lot of internal character struggle and conflict. But also, once Ruby starts developing feelings for Arcas, there's a lot of internal conflict there because he's supposed to be the enemy, but she has these feelings for him. Also internal conflict because she doesn't think that he returns them. So those are really good examples of internal conflict, both for guilt, but also romantic internal conflict. And lastly, just a good example of micro conflict from Frostblood. There's a training scene where they're going back and forth and she's losing her temper and trying to control her powers, and Arcas is getting fed up with her. And he throws her into an icy, lake stream thing. And that, of course, makes her even more mad because now she's wet and she's cold. And that's just good micro scene conflict. It's a scene with a lot of back and forth dialogue and then one character doing something to another character that adversely affects them. So just a good example of micro conflict on a scene level. I could honestly go on and on. I could pick any book, any well-told story, and give you good examples of all of these types of conflict. But I won't because we just don't have time for that. But I hope this was an illustrative and instructive overview of kind of conflict, why it's important, why the stakes are especially important, how they relate to the conflict, some ideas of kind of what you can do and how you can employ conflict in your writing. If you work on the different kinds of conflict and really think about your stakes, and I beg of you, make it personal, never forget to make it personal, you will write stronger, more compelling fiction that has people turning the pages, caring about your characters, and itching to read. Drop me comments down below, any questions that you have. I also love suggestions for topics if there's anything else that you want to hear about. If you want to beg me not to use the Hunger Games as an example anymore, I probably won't listen, but you can try. Just, hit me up down below. Give it a thumbs up if you liked this so I know to do more of these craft type videos for you. If you're not subscribed to the channel but you're interested in watching more videos like this, I'd always appreciate a subscription. Just don't forget to hit the notification bell. It'll tell you whenever I post a new video. So thank you as always for watching, and happy writing, everyone.